Hello, History 362. So, before we dive into the theme of the Hellenistic world and the coming of Rome, that is, thinking of the Hellenistic world having to orientate to the Western Mediterranean, I want to devote one last lecture to kind of themes of culture and society. And I want to return to what is, again, a big theme of our course, namely the theme of Greeks and non-Greeks. And actually, for this lecture, what I actually want to do is look at three artifacts that sort of deal with the theme of Greeks and non-Greeks. So the first of the artifacts that I want to look at are a couple of rock-cut inscriptions that are put up by not a Hellenistic king, but an Indian king, and are found in Kandahar, in what's now modern-day Afghanistan. And these are the rock-cut inscriptions of King Ashoka. One thing that happens after Alexander the Great's invasion of the Indus River Valley is that a new dynasty emerges. The Greeks call him Sandrakatas. His Indian name is Chandragupta. He actually has some diplomatic contacts with Seleucus I Nicator. Seleucus comes across the Hindu Kush and meets Chandragupta and basically is given a bunch of elephants so that he will just leave. But Chandragupta actually manages to put together a new, really quite remarkable empire that unifies eventually much of subcontinental India. And so Ashoka, who comes to power around 269 BC, is one of his successors. At this time, remember, Seleucid power in the Far East is somewhat waning during the reign of Antiochus I and Antiochus II. The Seleucids are actually having trouble controlling even up to the Hindu Kush. And so it seems that the area around Kandahar, parts of Afghanistan, start to fall under the sway or the hegemony of Ashoka and the Mauryan Empire. Excuse me. So as a result, one thing that Ashoka did is, after waging a war in Kalinga, which is in India, he regrets the violence of his military campaign and converts to Buddhism. And as sort of to mark this conversion, of course, also just to blazon his power, he, throughout his realm, puts up a series of rock-cut inscriptions, many of which have a somewhat standardized text. They're written in different languages. Some are written on big rocks, some are written on pillars. But we find two such inscriptions in Kandahar. One is written just in Greek and seems to be part of this big formulaic inscription that, again, there are multiple versions elsewhere. Another is written in both Greek and Aramaic, Aramaic being the sort of administrative language of the old Achaemenid Empire, and seems to also be kind of a little more maybe translating some concepts for a Greek or at least non-Buddhist audience. So what is sort of remarkable here, though, is that when we think about sort of the Greek and non-Greek, here we have, in this kind of liminal zone, what's again modern-day Afghanistan, we have a Buddhist king who is largely centered on an Indian subcontinental empire, nonetheless inscribing an inscription in Greek that describes Buddhist belief. And so I thought maybe I'd just read a little bit for you. So this is from the extract of the 13th Rock Edict. When he had been consecrated 8 years, the beloved of the gods, that is Ashoka, the king Piyadasi, still Ashoka, that's just his sort of title, conquered Kalinga. 150,000 people were deported, 100,000 were killed, and many times that number perished. Afterwards now, that Kalinga was annexed, the beloved of the gods very earnestly practiced Dhamma, desired Dhamma, and taught Dhamma. On conquering Kalinga, the beloved of the gods felt remorse, for when an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of the people is extremely grievous to the beloved of the gods and weighs heavily on his mind. What is even more deplorable to the beloved of the gods is that those who dwell there, whether Brahmins, Saramanas, or those of other sects, so these are thinking about religious Indian religious terms, or householders who show obedience to their teachers and behave well and devotedly towards their friends, acquaintances, colleagues, relatives, slaves, and servants, all suffer violence, murder, and separation from their loved ones. Here, and of course, because these standardized texts, although sometimes in translation, go up all over the empire, we have King Ashoka's sort of internal turmoil, his sadness over the violence he's inflicted, how that relates to his new Buddhist beliefs. All of that is now being worked out, again, in inscriptions across the subcontinent, but also in a Greek inscription in Kandahar. We also have again, another nearby inscription, the bilingual inscription in Greek and Aramaic, and it seems to actually come from slightly later because it notes that it's in the 10th year of Ashoka's kind of conversion, and it reads, 10 years having elapsed, King Piyadasis, here again they're using a kind of honorary title to describe Ashoka, revealed piety to men. From this time he made men more pious, and everything prospers on the whole earth. The king abstains from the flesh of living creatures and all other men, and the hunters and fishermen of the king have ceased hunting. Those who could not control themselves have ceased to be lacking in self-control as far as possible. They have become obedient to their father and mother and to their elders, contrary to what happened before. And henceforth, by acting in this way, they will live better and more profitably in every respect. So again, a Greek inscription describing Buddhist vegetarianism, and Buddhist precepts of self-control of an Indian king, yet aimed towards an audience that either speaks Greek or speaks Aramaic, the Persian administrative language. So it seems that Mayaran control over this region was somewhat fleeting, but the fact that these inscriptions remain behind, I think really mark how, in the Hellenistic world, this sort of part of the Middle East really is a cultural crossroads. All right, so the next sort of artifact, although it's actually an entire city, the ruins of an entire city, is the city of Ikanum, again, in modern-day Afghanistan. And this city was actually discovered by one of the last Khans of Afghanistan, educated in the Western institutions, but he was out hunting and he found some Greek artifacts which he recognized. This prompted him to contact some of his acquaintances in Western academia, and between 1965 and 1978, there was a series of excavations which revealed a Greek city, a recognizably Greek city, chock full of recognizably Greek artifacts in the middle of Afghanistan. And at the time, this was kind of a surprise, in that in a place that was seen as so kind of fundamentally Eastern, to literally use an antiquated term, Oriental. Here there was a Greek city that if you had found it in, say, Western Asia Minor, you wouldn't be surprised at all. But it was out on the Oxus River. This city had initially been a Seleucid foundation, so it was one of these Seleucid cities founded to control the vastness of Seleucid space. It subsequently, remember, the Seleucids lose control of Bactria de facto in probably the 240s, and that's acknowledged by Antiochus the Great. So it was subsequently controlled by a group, by Bactrian kings, the most prominent of whom was Eucratides. In fact, it's possible that people are still arguing about what was the name of Ikanum. Some people think at one point it was an Alexandria. It seems possibly later in its history it may have been called Eucratidea. Regardless, it was clearly a very important Bactrian city until the collapse of the Bactrian kingdom in the middle of the 2nd century BC. Essentially, the Bactrians, we don't know exactly what happens, but they seem to be overrun by an invasion of people coming off the Eurasian steppe. And with that, Ikanum ceases to be inhabited as a working city. Nonetheless, it has many things that are recognizable as a Greek city, including a Greek-style theater, a Greek-style gymnasium. It actually has a kind of Persian-style, sort of Seleucid-style palace, extensive Greek-style fortifications. And so, again, none of these are necessarily remarkable except for their location. Culturally, there are plenty of things to suggest that a good deal of recognizably Greek culture took place there. There is, for example, an inscription one Cineas, who claims that he, in the foundation of the city, had gone to Delphi, had gotten from Delphi a series of relatively kind of generic Delphic maxims, and has then had them inscribed in Greek. And that inscription survives. And so here you have a Greek Delphic inscription in the middle of rural Afghanistan. And of course, there were a number of other artifacts. Again, many, for example, statue of Heracles, architectural decorations. Many, again, are sort of just stereotypically Greek. There are a few artifacts that do show a degree of kind of synergy. One is this is actually maybe the most famous artifact to come out of Ikanum. It is a plate that shows Kubale, a goddess from Asia Minor that is kind of adopted into the Greek pantheon, being pulled by lions. But the style, while there's sort of some Greek style, the style does actually seem to be a bit of a synthesis between Greek and Central Asian style. So this piece kind of seems to show a work of art that is, again, kind of created in a kind of liminal zone, which Bactria very much was. So these artifacts circulate occasionally. I had a chance to see them when they came through San Francisco. Maybe if you ever see the Treasures of Ikanum, you can go see them. But again, they are remarkable for representing this outpost of Greek culture in the very far-flung parts of first the Seleucid and then the Bactrian frontier. All right. So the last artifact that I want to discuss that sort of presents Greeks and non-Greeks is the Rosetta Stone. So here we move from the frontiers of the Seleucid Empire to Ptolemaic Egypt. And the Rosetta Stone is perhaps the most famous and best known of everything that I've talked about today. It's on display. It's one of the prized possessions of the British Museum. If you've been to the British Museum, you may have seen it. If you go to the British Museum, you should see it. So it's actually one of the most famous artifacts, perhaps, of the whole Ptolemaic dynasty. And of course, it's famous because the Rosetta Stone is a trilingual inscription. It contains, and it's the same text is inscribed in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Then it's inscribed in Demotic Egyptian, so Egyptian that is written in a kind of script rather than in hieroglyphics. And finally, it's inscribed in Greek. And so the stone was recovered by Napoleon on his campaign, and it was finally, the hieroglyphics were finally deciphered in the 19th century. It took them a while, but they were finally able to use the Greek text to decipher the hieroglyphics, as well as the Demotic. So this document is a inscription that honors King Ptolemy, and the stele is erected by an association of Egyptian priests. So the agency behind this document actually comes from the native Egyptian priesthood, although of all of the aspects of native Egyptian society, the priesthood pretty much is the most willing to collaborate with the Ptolemaic dynasty. These guys are for the most part, not a part of the resistance. And indeed, this dedication comes at a moment that is otherwise a nadir for the Ptolemaic dynasty. It's erected in 196 BC during the reign of Ptolemy V. So this is a moment when there is still a raging native revolt in the Tobayid and the Upper Nile that will not be fully crushed for another decade. So the priests here are proclaiming their loyalty to the Ptolemaic king, not to the supposed rebel pharaoh to the south. Also, this comes basically at the end of the war with Antiochus the Great, that has seen massive defeats, including the loss of Coele-Syria and a number of Aegean possessions. So despite these hammer blows to the Ptolemaic dynasty, the priests are asserting their continued loyalty to the king. On one hand, the reason that they're doing so is they are thanking the king for dedications, particularly of silver, that he has given to the Egyptian temples. So on one hand, here we have benefactions, indeed benefactions that by Greek standards, as you've read, might even be considered euergetism. But here they are also, we might more cynically look at them as payoffs to buy the continued loyalty of this key aspect of the Egyptian elite. But in giving this benefaction, the Egyptian priests are also able to sort of cast the Ptolemaic dynasty as they would like to see it, namely as a dynasty that looks, for want of a better word, much more Egyptian. And I thought I would just read briefly how they describe King Ptolemy, without going into reading through the entire description, but just briefly. Since King Ptolemy, the ever-living, beloved of Ptah, Egyptian god, God manifest and beneficent, born of King Ptolemy and Queen Arsinoe, father-loving of the gods, that's all rather Greek, he has confirmed many benefits on the temples and those who dwell in them, and on all the subjects of his kingdom. Being a god born of a god and a goddess, just as Horus, son of Isis and Osiris, who avenged his father Osiris, and being benevolently disposed towards the gods, has dedicated to the temples revenues in money and corn, and has sustained many expenses to bring Egypt to a state of prosperity and to establish temples, and has given away freely from his own means and of the revenues and dues he receives from Egypt. Some he has completely remitted, and others he has reduced, so that the people and all others might enjoy prosperity during his reign. And he has remitted the debts to the crown which were owed by the people in Egypt and those in the rest of his kingdom, which were considerable. And he has freed, and this goes on and on and on. So on one hand, note the way that he's described, described in part through his own dynastic connections, but also in relation to Egyptian gods, beloved of Ptah, and in particular, the Egyptian priests feeling perfectly comfortable talking about how he's the product of a incestuous relationship, just as the Egyptian god Isis and Osiris produce the kind of pharaoh god Horus, and they are very happy to read that on to the Ptolemaic dynasty. So in the Rosetta Stone, you can go and see it. I think actually part of the striking aspect, I mean, again, some people will come up to this and can't read the whole kind of long list of benefactions, which actually go on and on. I was looking for a good place to break in the sentence and had trouble finding it. It goes on and on, all the good things that Ptolemy has done, including dealing with, it seems, some Egyptian soldiers who are being pardoned, perhaps some who have even taken part in the revolt. But suffice it to say, all of these good things are things that the Egyptian priests like, and they're framing that. Yet, if you can't read all those good things, you can nonetheless go and see the difference in the writing. You can see the difference between the hieroglyphics, of course, a priestly language, the Egyptian text, and the Greek. And certainly that itself has its own kind of tenor, I think, in some ways sort of proclaiming this kind of multicultural kingdom in which it's the Egyptians, particularly the Egyptians' priests, who have significant agency, even as they thank the king for all the nice things that he's done. All right, so those are just three artifacts I thought I would briefly talk about, but all of which sort of suggest the complexities of relations between Greeks and non-Greeks. A Buddhist inscription in Greek in Afghanistan, a Greek city on the frontier, Bactrian frontier, and finally a dedication by Egyptian priests using their Egyptian hieroglyphs, their Egyptian language, and Greek. All a reminder of the complex interplay between Greeks and non-Greeks in the Hellenistic world.